Moving on now, though, a senior Defence chief has told a parliamentary inquiry that it's unsustainable for Defence Force personnel to help with natural disasters and defend Australia. Joining us live now is Professor Peter Dean, Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre. Peter, good to see you. Thanks for your time. Do we expect too much of our Defence Force when we do assume that they'll sweep in and help out every time a natural disaster strikes?
I think at the moment we do. I think if you look at the Defence Strategic Review, which earlier this year noted the deteriorating strategic circumstances that we have in our international environment. And fundamentally, the ADF's job is to defend Australia, to help secure Australia and secure that international environment. And what we've seen with the rise of climate disasters, with pandemics, that the ADF's resources have been used to counter these pandemics. And that's had a particular effect on the readiness of the Australian Defence Force, on the morale of the Australian Defence Force and its ability to recruit people into the Australian Defence Force. And the Defence Strategic Review earlier this year noted that we needed to move to a national defence basis. It talked a lot about climate change. And really, if you're moving to a much more whole-of-nation national defence posture, then of course the states and local governments, whose primary responsibility is to respond to natural disasters, need to invest more in the resources that they need. Now, of course, the ADF is there if it's desperately needed as a force of last resort. But it's actually not equipped, it's not organised, and it's not got the appropriate command and control relationships to undertake these natural disasters, because ultimately they're about civil response. And really this falls into the basket, particularly of the state governments. And this is where the state governments really need to step up to invest more resources at that level, so they can release the Defence Force to concentrate on its primary duty, which is on national defence and defending Australia and making sure there's an appropriate balance of power in our region for our national sovereignty and security.
Because these natural disasters, I mean, unfortunately, they're becoming more regular events, and calling on the ADF doesn't seem to be sort of last resort now. It's a pretty standard response that we're seeing. When you say impacts on morale as well, what did you mean by that? Is it frustrating for those in the Defence Force to have to go out and help in those instances?
Well, of course, the Defence Force is one of the most admired institutions in the country, and they ultimately protect and support our community. And the Defence Force members, of course, love to be out and support the community, but that's not what they enrolled and enlisted into the Defence Force to do. That's not their primary responsibility or their primary job. They enlisted to be in the Army, Navy and Air Force, or in Cyber Command, or working in our Space Command to do different tasks to defend the nation. And a continuous removal of those troops away from their core functions, from their warfighting functions and the things that they signed up and they trained to do, and that their units are organised to do, that they're trained to do, they're brought into the culture and into the roles and responsibilities of their particular units or the particular areas of their service. And that's what they're designed to do. So going out into the community can be a very positive thing for the ADF members. It can be very good. But when you're spending large chunks of your time away from your core responsibilities, then it does start to affect the morale, the retention. And we know that. We've seen the statistics that have come out from the Defence Force. We've seen the feedback from Defence Force members that while they value supporting the community, they don't see that as their number one priority. And of course, as these climate change issues increase, we do know that our international response force, our ability to help our neighbours, our near neighbours in the region, which is really important in these things, falls to the Defence Force. So if they're working on the domestic scheme, they can't respond in that area. So this is about roles and responsibilities. And it's also about the need. To be honest, when natural disasters strike, it's from a community support perspective, from a state government's perspective, it's actually quite easy for a state premier or a local mayor to get on television and demand or ask for the ADF to come to their assistance. But that is not always the most appropriate way to get support. Often there are domestic related support measures that are much better suited to actually doing that response than the ADF is as well. So I think we also have to remember we're tasking the ADF to do things that are not their primary responsibility, not their primarily trained for or prepare or organised or equipped for, where that really should fall to the state emergency services, to the police, to the fire brigade. And I think we as a nation have to have a conversation that if the resources that we have at the moment are not appropriate to do that, where does that investment have to come? And I think that investment largely has to come at the state level.
But I did want to ask you, I understand you've just returned from Japan. What sort of insights did you get in terms of how close our defence ties are with that nation? What practical exercises are we carrying out with them at the moment, and how do you see that relationship progressing?
Yes, I only got back off the plane this morning. I had some wonderful access to senior members of the Japanese government and Japanese military, and it's my 6th trip to Japan, and I've never seen the Japanese so forward-leaning in relation to their engagement with Australia. Of course, we now have a reciprocal access agreement with the Japanese. We're seeing a significant number of Japanese forces come down to train during our large military exercises such as Talisman Sabre. But I think what's really critical, Japan released a national security strategy and a national defence strategy late last year in December. And if you put that side by side against the Australian Defence Strategic Review that came out earlier this year, you can see there are exceptionally large numbers of continuity. The way we assess the strategic environment, the emphasis on protecting state sovereignty and the balance of power in the region, the focus on long-range missiles and strike and deterrence and defence through denial are all really key synergistic features between our two countries. And as we've seen from the conflict in Ukraine, the ability to work together in partnership, the ability to help maintain that international order that leads to peace and prosperity is really important. So we're at the stage now with Japan, I think with the reciprocal access agreement now in place, it's how do you operationalise that? How do you take that next step forward? And to do that in particular with our partner, the United States, because what all three of us, and of course, India is a part of the Quad, and more broadly, the Southeast Asian nations are trying to do is maintain a peaceful and prosperous region so that we can all live in peace and harmony. And that's becoming increasingly difficult in the deteriorating international environment. I think there's a huge amount of synergies between our two countries, but there's great opportunities, particularly business opportunities around defence industrial production, about the sharing of technology, dual-use technology, and in areas, particularly things such as cybersecurity, where I think there is a massive opportunity for our two countries to work together.
Peter Dean, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.